Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a Saturday here in Minnesota. I just had a giant cat jump up on my stand there. Hopefully she goes her own direction. Uh, Cats. You can't tell them nothing. Anyway, we're just going to cover a couple fun things today. Some records I've gotten in the mail recently that I've been kind of digging into and enjoying, including one that kind of I don't want to call it a throat grabber, but it shook my foundations. It was so awesome. It was just fantastic. It still makes me smile thinking about it. And there goes the cat. First, we're going to talk about a gal by the name of Maxine Sullivan. I'll try to throw some slides up here for this, but she is a great singer that gets very little recognition for some reason. Her body of work isn't large, especially from the classic periods. She never gets corralled in by Norman Granz to record with all those greats like an Ella Fitzgerald did. But she's considered definitely an influence on Ella Fitzgerald, and I think you can hear that quite clearly. And even Sarah Vaughan is supposed to be kind of in that same school somewhat, with the enunciation, the clarity of tone, the ability to change the melodies as she's going. She's an interesting persona. And again, I'm not going to say I know a ton about her. From my little bit of research I've done, she was born, I believe, in 1911. She initially works with John Kirby, and who was one of her 4 husbands, by the way. She, in 1937, has a pretty big hit with covering a kind of swing version of the Scottish folk song Loch Lomond. And I'm a big Tintin fan, the comic books, the Belgian Hergé comic books that take place in the middle of the 20th century. And there's a famous cartoon or comic that takes place in Scotland called The Black Island, where Tintin's dog Snowy gets drunk on a whiskey or a single malt. That's called Loch Lomond. So it's got a nice little crossover there for me. I know I got some Tintin fans out there, but probably some whiskey malt fans as well. But it was a big hit for her, doing the Scottish traditional in a swing kind of sense. And what it led to was her kind of becoming known for taking traditional folk stuff and giving it kind of a black swing version. And she was fairly successful with that for a while. That was a lot that was done in cohorts with Claude Thornhill, the great piano player. And so they did some pretty interesting stuff together. She goes to New York and sings at Club Onyx, which is on 52nd Street, part of that entire strip of amazing clubs that would have enthralled me for a week of nights. You know, I could just go from club to club watching these greats play, from the beboppers all the way to the swing guys, the small groups, the piano, Art Tatum. It would have been an insane place to be, New York, 52nd Street. And there's probably about a 10-year period where that would have been the place to be. And if you go back in time, New York in the 50s, it would have been something. An energy and a pulse in that post-war boom. And economics are positive. There's a hope for open mobility for the minorities, which obviously becomes deferred. But there's an excitement in the street. Baseball is the national pastime completely in the 1950s. The other sports aren't even on the radar. The NFL doesn't exist. Basketball is just starting. The Knickerbockers and the Boston Celtics are just in their infancy. And basketball has very little exposure. None of it was on the national landscape. And hockey was a very regional sport, of course, unless you were in Toronto, Montreal, or maybe Boston. And Detroit had some success in the 50s in hockey as well. But New York had all the baseball World Series in the 50s. All of them. The Giants, the Dodgers, the Yankees, Jazz is centered there. So all these interesting personalities are coming together. Baseball's starting to break the color line as well. And so there's an optimism in New York, I think, that is electric, and it's part of why a place like 52nd Street would have had more neon to it than just the signs. There would have been a hope and an electric belief and a promise that we're kind of making progress. And of course, it's always in fits and starts. That's always how it's been, and probably always how it will be, sadly. But so Maxine Sullivan's at the Onyx Club. She ends up being in a film called Going Places with the great Louis Armstrong. So she's becoming quite renowned, and yet because for lack of recording with known figures, there's just, it's hard to really understand why a gal that's so influential gets so little press coverage today. And again, that's in part because there's nobody who owns a whole vault of her material that's sponsoring documentaries and box sets and reissues saying we need to get that material back out there. Her first two recordings, according to her discography on Wikipedia, is this fantastic Period Records, and this is also on Period Records, which was Leonard Feather, the British pianist slash jazz entrepreneur. He launched Period Records. He's got Django Reinhardt on it. He's got these Maxine Sullivan sessions. Here is kind of an honor to Fats Waller's music, who of course is one of the great Harlem stride pianists and leaders of black honesty in lyrical form. He's a character, and he says some things that might have crossed some lines in those days, but he wasn't really scared to do it. Fats Waller was something else. And then Andy Razoff, another name I'm not super familiar with, who looks like a brother on that photograph, but Andy Razoff does not sound like a brother. He's also one of the guys who contributed the songs to this record, but it's done with other musicians. It's not with Fats Waller. It's with Charlie Shavers, who I've spoken about many times. The great Milt Hinton and O.C. Johnson are on drums and bass. Wendell Marshall plays bass on a couple tracks. Dick Hyman's on the piano. And Jerome Richardson, a fantastic flautist, and plays some sax as well. He's on this in an early session here. And Buster Bailey's on it as well, clarinetist, and I think he plays some alto at times. But so that's an incredible record by an incredible group, recorded by Leonard Feather on the Period Records label. That's a hard thing to find, and yet these records aren't that expensive. I'm kind of shocked. This is a great piece. It documents a lot of history. The second one here, and what's weird, as short as their discography is, this one's number 1909. This one's number 1207. So there doesn't seem to be much coherency in the numbers ascribed to these sessions. But this one has, I believe what it is current 56 renditions of a lot of those folk songs she did back in the 30s with a swing in her sound. I think she recreates them here again. I'm not positive. Maybe it is the original recordings, but I think these are recreations. I can't recall. I'll see if the backliner notes say real quick. No, it's with Shavers, Pettiford, Hinton, O.C. Johnson. So again, it's folk songs and some popular songs being done in 1956 by those incredible musicians. And again, you have mostly black musicians there. And one of the great leaders of the jazz vocal innovative sound, who influenced Ella Fitzgerald, and yet Maxine Sullivan is very much under the radar. It sounds like she actually left music in 58, and she becomes a nurse for over a decade, and just kind of walks away. Then she ends up showing up at some jazz festivals later in her life, and has a bit of a resurgency on a small scale, but she gets back into music at least. But again, her recorded legacy is not huge, and from the period where I talk about the most, the 40s, 50s, and then the 60s, there's very little recorded. But Norman Granz should have grabbed her up, because had she made sessions on the Verve label with Lester Young and Sweets Edison and Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster, I think she'd have had more exposure. The big names on there were Charlie Shavers and maybe Jerome Richardson, and those are, of course, Rosie Johnson and Pettiford. Those are decent sized names, but again, why is she so overlooked? It's a bit mystifying to me. Just a fantastic sound. But again, she was married 4 times, and then she passes away, and her legacy's just kind of slipped into obscurity. And here, the Jazz Shepherd, part of what I want to do is not just talk about blue notes and tone poets and the big successful artists like the Lee Morgans and the Miles Davises and John Coltrane's. I'm trying to bring some light to some of the stuff in between the cracks that often gets overlooked. And I've also come to realize that a lot of the artists who are overlooked, it's almost entirely linked to what labels were recording you. If you're recording on Everest with Charlie Shavers, it's not going to have a lot of impact on today's buyer. If you record on a Verve, who has big distribution and publicity, or on a Blue Note, who has this incredible publicity resurgence, or even Blue Note's star is bigger now than it ever was in the 50s, in the 60s even for that matter, I would think. The excitement over a tone poet being reissued right now for a good price. I don't know what their numbers are doing, but I'm guessing they're probably selling 5,000, 10,000 copies of those records right now. And that's better than what Blue Note was doing in the 50s on original releases. So anyway, next artist we're going to look at. But again, a lot of those great artists, if they'd gotten a record at Blue Note or a record or two on Verve, the sidemen, the publicity around those labels would have these artists come more to light. And it seems to be a predominant reason behind who we remember and who we forget. And so it's got me thinking of this list of musicians who I wish had got to make a record at Blue Note just so that more people would know who they were. Joe Wilder, anybody? We talked... Oh, sorry. Wrong record. This is... Where did I put it? Right here. This is the great King Pleasure, who's kind of a vocal A's guy, which means he's recreating famous solos with his voice. Watch this. He's emulating a horn with lyric, and he's renowned for it. He has a classic record on Prestige back in the 7000 series, like 7112 or so. This is on the West Coast label Hi-Fi Jazz, and some nice musicians are on this, and I've enjoyed listening to this twice. It's just fun. Gerald Wiggins is on this, Teddy Edwards is on this, Matthew Gee is on this, Harold Land is on this, Willie Middlebrooks and Earl Palmer. So some pretty serious musicians. And I can't remember who the gal is singing here, but it's fantastic stuff. There's some really fun versions of these songs. Moody's Mood for Love, Tomorrow's Another Day, Little Boy Don't Get Scared. And again, the band is just insane. And so it's fun to hear. It sounds like Harold Land. It's fun to hear a guy with his voice reiterating famous famous instrumental solos with lyric and melody and phrasing and rhythmic shaping. It's an interesting and probably challenging thing to do. But King Pleasure probably is really under the radar as well. His biggest, probably renowned records that went on Prestige. But his stuff is out there for $4, $5, $8, and they're fun records and they're really interesting. And there's something if you put on when your friends are there, they're going to be like, "What is that? That's cool." And all those records that we think are so jazzy and avant-garde and heavy Coltrane, most people aren't going to, when you put that on, going to be like, "Oh, that's fun." It's very self-indulgent. It communicates with you on a one-to-one basis. It's not going to bring the room in most of the time. But some of this fun, lighter side of jazz, both black and white, is great at bringing in a non-jazz person and be like, "Ooh, I like the mood this is creating. I like the atmosphere." Because that's part of what the deal is. A lot of people don't even know, but they want music to be a mood setter. They want it to kind of be the element that sets the template and the background for what's going on this evening. And so anything that's going to be too intense or sonically bludgeoning or filled with tension, most people are going to shy from it just because they're not in the mood to feel tension. They're trying to escape their own tension. And so unless you go to that art and put the needle on the record yourself and hope that you can address some of your shortcomings today by their addressing their shortcomings through their radical playing, it's hard for that to embrace the rest of the people in the room at that time. It's the kind of art you have to kind of go to yourself in a singular moment. And so this stuff is fun. It deserves more light on it once again than people give it. If you recall, I played this record for you guys probably about a month ago. It's a Frank Minion, the song Stylings of 1970, which I don't think they really captured 1970 very well, but it was really fun. And I told you how he kind of embodied Nat King Cole, Harry Belafonte, Louis Armstrong, just all these, and he had a really unique take on a lot of things that were his own. It was just a really interesting guy that had a really interesting approach to a lot of things. But I also told you there was another record of his that came out on Bethlehem probably a year later, and I hadn't been able to find it, and of course I have found it. It's a Fresh Sounds reissue. I probably paid a little more than I should, but I was so intrigued by the first one that I had to reach out and grab it, and this record kind of blew me away. And on side one is a very interesting suite piece. It's a long suite, and it's called Soft Land of Make Believe, an introduction to Black Opium Street. And it's kind of this encapsulating the jazz age and the black experience. It's very interesting stuff. And Tommy Flanagan, George Tucker, Roland Alexander, and Danny Richmond round out the group. So it's a pretty modern. Alexander and Richmond are very forward-thinking. Flanagan's a bebop into a hard bop giant. George Tucker's a great bass player. It's an interesting suite. What he's saying, what they're talking about, some of the playing is just fantastic. I'm gonna find my coffee. It's a really cool, swinging, great group that I think people would pass up if they saw it, not knowing Frank Minion's name. I'm gonna guess that this was recorded by the King label, and then King, who bought out Bethlehem, issued some of their jazzier titles from their back catalog and some newer sessions on Bethlehem versus their own imprint, and used that Bethlehem name and prestige for some of their own jazz titles. But the saxophone, the Parker, it's just a really interesting thing. And there's like, I'll read some of the sweet autobiography of music, Bongo Blues, Oddsville, USA, Things Ain't Like They Used to Went, Salam My Child, Laughing Boy. It's got a lot of African American euphemisms and slang. Nobody Knows My Jazz Music. It's like he's got some even bebop in it. It's pretty clever. But as much as I enjoyed that, and I did enjoy it, it's side two that really was the revelation. And he recreates here in what must be late 1959 or early 1960 due to its serial number, flamenco sketches. And I'm worried about playing that as loud as I did, that the censors are going to think that was actually Miles Davis, because it sounds just like Miles Davis. He's doing two different vocal layers. It's outstanding. It's exciting. It's so interesting. It's so... Wow. It's so cool. The dissonance of the different instruments, the chordings of it, to hear it all done vocally. I'm worried they're going to censor this episode because of this, but I hope they don't because I want y'all to hear it. I'm going to pull it down, but you should really listen to this. And you kind of wonder yourself, well, just how do they get that rhythm section sounding so perfectly, sans the horns? You know what I mean? He's doing all the horns, but the piano, the bass, and the drums, it's spot on. And then you go and you look at who's playing on the track. Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. I mean, what the fuck? He's got the actual Miles Davis rhythm section playing, and he's doing Miles and Coltrane and Adam. It's like, what? What? How do I not know about this? How is not everybody talking about this? And what's crazy is Round Midnight comes next. And here's goes the solo. He's doing the solo.
Must you stay away?
This is Round Midnight. And
when you stray,
just wait. Again, with Evans, Jimmy Cobb, and Paul Chambers. I didn't really know what to say. It's pretty fantastic, and I'm not sure how. Yeah, it's so cool. And then there's a third one.
I do pretty well till after sundown.
Fantastic.
It's from making up.
Number 3, side 2. So what? And that's Bill Evans. That's Paul Chambers. So you might say to yourself, that sounds awful lot like Miles Davis, but it is that same rhythm section. And I'm just tickled by it. Talk about sampling someone's work using their actual musicians. And how he got the clearance. How do I not know about this? How have I not heard how Miles Davis, what he thought? Did he love it? Did he hate it? If anybody can play Paul Chambers and Bill Evans,
I used to sing the blues.
what?
I tried to keep you here beside me.
Are you kidding me? And he even does some of the sour notes of Miles where he kind of bends and slurs and has some dissonance. He incorporates that. So we actually sing it kind of flat and then round it off. It's Frank Minion's 2 records on Bethlehem are 2 of the most interesting records I've heard. He reinterprets so many things, from calypso to Latin to pop to blues to jazz to modal. Then they actually round the record out with 2 songs that I love from the first one, Watermelon and You I Love, which are both fantastic songs that they probably just filled it out for space-wise. But it says here the first 3 tracks were done with the famous Miles Davis anchorman Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb, who played Frank's vocal adaptations of Miles' flamenco sketches beautifully. For the first time, I hear a vocalist sing the tune in 6/8 time, and in minor, certainly no easy way to execute a melody. So What by Miles and Round Midnight by Monk round out this group's work, as Frank demonstrates his inventiveness with multi-voicing on flamenco and Midnight. The lyrics are his, except on Midnight, and blah blah blah. I don't think what I'm playing for you right now is doing the justice. You really need to hear it yourself. And it's such a cool coffee Java house rendition of a song you've heard a million times. And how it's escaped me all these years, how all the years of talking about these artists and these songs, no one's ever said, have you heard Frank Minion's version of So What with Bill Evans and Paul Chambers and Jimmy? What? I was in disbelief. I was in disbelief that I was listening to this when I opened it up the other day and played it, and I didn't have a clue what was about to hit me. And so Bill Evans, you don't get to find very often. It was worth what I paid for it, a little more than I should have. I paid $40 plus shipping for this reissue. And again, it's a little more than I like to pay for a reissue. I'd rather hold out for an original for hopefully $60, $80 for something like this. But If I find an original someday, I'll probably put a bid on it. But I'm glad I had it. It was introspecting and really enlightening and delightful. I mean, someone out there's gonna be like, oh yeah, in the comments, oh yeah, I know that stuff. That's great. I'm surprised you didn't know about it. I'd be like, well, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't somebody tell me about this sooner? It's fun. It's hipster. It's delightful. I feel like I'm on a Vespa, putting on my little helmet, gonna drive to the market and have a croissant by the side of the river's edge. It's just so neato. It's just so cool. And I'm not cool enough in a way. I do want to give a shout out to Tony Soprano, the great James Gandolfini, who passed away back in 2013. Anybody who's not seen The Sopranos, it's the greatest performance I've ever seen by an actor. I was watching it with my family recently, and it's such an insightful show. And it's not just about tits and guns and the mob. That's all a vehicle to talk about psychology and depression and the anxiety and the uncertainty of life, the impending feeling of doom, a piano hanging over your head. There's so much insight that happens in therapy that a lot of people who watch the show don't ever seem to get. I've heard people say they wish the therapy stuff was edited out. And to me, that's the entire point of the show. And it was meant to drive home an interesting thing. Most of us in therapy or in our own head think, if I had more sex, if I had more money, if I had more power, I'd be happy. Or at least I'd be happier. And I think David Chase, the creator, was thinking that same thing to himself. Who spent lots of time in therapy, I've read. I wish I had more sex, more money, more money, or more power. And so he creates this person, this persona, in the mobster Tony Soprano, who has money, who has power, and who has all the sex he can handle. Plus his family, his wife, and his children, and his other obligations to the mob. And he has these panic attacks and anxiety and depression, and he's trying to sort through it all. He's got an incredibly crazy mother who impacts a lot of his psychology, and it's incredibly insightful into the desperation that breeds itself in America today. Incredibly insightful show, and if you're not seeing the psychology of the show, you're missing it. It's not about tits and guns. Tits and guns are fun, but they don't carry your show for 6+ seasons like The Sopranos. And it's one of the greatest shows of all time. And Jimmy Gandolfini's performance as Tony Soprano is the greatest performance I've ever seen by anybody. On television especially, but even in film, because there's so many hours compiled of this guy's performance. And he has to pull off threatening and menacing and completely brutal lethality. But also it has to be meek, insecure, divided, anxious and depressed, and vulnerable in order for the show's psychology to work. And so the fear, the anxiety, the depression, the uncertainty is all countered by this incredibly opulent and violent person who struggles with all these things on the inside. And he's also in a place, in a role, where he's not really allowed to show vulnerability or weakness. So it's an incredibly interesting dichotomy and a look into the human psyche. And his performance is just incredible. From being a menacing monster to being a loving father to being a completely motionless, depressed blob to being the loving wife, husband to being the most cheating, dalliant, evil. He's a very evil character, but he creates an empathy within you because of his own struggle and vulnerability and weakness that we relate to. And so he really embodies every emotional context and state you can think of, and he pulls them all off with a complete legitimacy and believability that I can't think of any performance in TV that has near the breadth of emotional context. Breaking Bad's great, but Mr. White, his persona is very limited. It's not, by the end you can't stand the guy. You know, you think of all the other great shows, The Wire is a great show, but there's not a character that's developed full of all these different personalities and emotional states. This guy, we're inside of his head and his emotions. Every episode, the seething of his breathing at times is the only soundtrack. Just his panicked and it's intense, it's insane, and it's meant for introspection. If you watch it for shallow surface and you walk away with only having seen that, you've missed the entire show. It's about psychology, and Tony's performance is just incredible. And there's a reason why he won all the awards those years. And then his performance with his wife, Edie Falco, as Carmela, she was equally unbelievable. And the show had a lot of other great characters as well. But again, Jimmy Gandolfini's performance as Tony is just unmatched. And they're rebooting a film that's going to be a precursor to the era that Sopranos was set in, going back to the 50s of the previous generation. And I'm thinking they're going to drive home some interesting changes in America over that generational gap. So I'm looking forward to that coming out. The Kings of Newark or something like that it's called. I talk about Newark a lot with Savoy, and this is where this whole thing takes place. The race riots and all that, the Italians being moved out. That's all part of the history of the Sopranos show and what that new episode's going to be about, Newark and the riots and all that. But again, love to Jimmy Gandolfini. If you haven't seen the show, I can't recommend it enough. The Wire and Sopranos are the two greatest shows I've ever seen. And one day I might tell you one's the greatest, one day I might tell you the other's the greatest. We're watching The Wire right now with my kids. It's for the second time. We watched it probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it's a powerful enough show and shows the black experience so honestly that it can move you to tears frequently. Feeling the helpless nature of their predicaments. A lot of these kids don't have much option but crime and drugs and prostitution, and even the politicians and the cops, no one's good or bad, everyone's both. Everyone's motivated by I and self, and there's such an honesty, the portrayal of the civic and social breakdowns of the American city in The Wire, and really the story is about Baltimore and the urban city and the urban decay in America. It's not really around one figure or one hero. The city is the character, and it's an incredible look and a very bleak look at the American urban decay. So The Wire's essential viewing as well. But again, Sopranos, if you haven't seen it, check it out. Let me know what you think. Y'all be safe. Check out Maxine Sullivan. Check out King Pleasure. And by all means, Frank Minion doing his thing. Special stuff. Peace.